There is an epidemic in North America. Our nation's most vulnerable citizens, Indigenous women, face an ongoing crisis of violent crime unmatched by any other minority group in the U.S. Missing and murdered, these women's stories are often lost to time and lack any national media coverage, but this does not make these women's stories any less important. In fact, we must examine this problem in order to put a stop to it. American Indian women face a murder rate 10 times that of the national average. Homicide is the third most common cause of death for American Indian women aged 10 to 24. According to RAINN, the Rape, Abuse, and Incest National Network, Native Americans are twice as likely to experience rape or sexual assault when compared to all races. They are at the greatest risk of sexual violence of any demographic in this country. Why is this such a huge problem? Who's trying to save these women? Where do they end up? A movement has sprouted in the last 30 years dedicated to ending the horrible epidemic of murdered and missing Indigenous women, with Indigenous activists and artists from across North America coming together in solidarity to protect their most vulnerable citizens. This movement is truly an inspiration, and we will dive right into it, but first, a bit of background. There is a misconception in this country that Native people don't exist anymore, that they were pushed onto reservations and forced into boarding schools until they all but disappeared. This is certainly not the case. Indigenous communities exist all across the US and Canada, and large reservations dot the western states. There are over 5 million self-identified Native Americans living in America. In July 2020, the Supreme Court ruled that about half of the entirety of the US state of Oklahoma is actually located on an Indian reservation. However, most Native people in the U.S. live in urban areas these days, and played a vital part in the building of cities like New York, Seattle, Minneapolis, and many others. In fact, the Mohawk Native American ironworkers helped build the Empire State Building, the United Nations, and many other iconic New York skyscrapers. Only about 30% of Native peoples in the U.S. live on reservation land, which can be very impoverished and lacking in basic infrastructure. According to the Pew Research Center, 1 in 4 Native Americans and Alaska Natives live in poverty and have higher rates of unemployment than the national average. These people make up part of an incredibly important and endangered cultural heritage and are living every day with the effects of hundreds of years of mistreatment and erasure by the federal government. This brings us back to the issue at hand. Why are Indigenous women and children so vulnerable in our society and so often the victims of violent crime? The answer is complex and multifaceted. Jurisdictional issues are a large part of why the epidemic of missing and murdered Indigenous women has persisted for so long. Tribal police forces do not have the authority to arrest non-native citizens on reservation land, and can only detain them until state police officials arrive. When put into context with the fact that on some reservations, 96% of sexual violence-related crimes against Native women are committed by non-natives, it can be stated that Native police forces do not have the proper ability to protect the women and children in their communities from outsiders. Native police forces are underfunded and understaffed, and must navigate a complicated web of bureaucracy between tribal, state, and federal governments to even initiate investigations into their large backlog of missing persons cases. These are all legacies of a history of settler colonialist policy in the US and Canada. Another reason is that the media rarely, if ever, covers stories about missing Indigenous women. According to the Urban Indian Health Institute, only 1/4 of stories about missing Indigenous women received any sort of news coverages on local, regional, or national media, with 47% of that coverage being about just one case. This is a silent epidemic for the Americans who do not struggle with the daily fear of their family members going missing or winding up dead. Luckily, there are people across the country and the globe who are fighting to protect Indigenous women from violence. In recent years, legislation has been put forward on a federal level to deal with this pressing issue. Savannah's Act, named for a Native girl who was found murdered, is a congressional act aimed at raising awareness and resources for missing persons cases that take place on Indian land. The act passed the House just 1 month ago, September 2020, but has still yet to pass the Republican-controlled Senate. There's also the Not Invisible Act of 2019, which forced Congress to create a joint commission on violent crime in the Native community. Due to the lack of media coverage, Indigenous women have had to take action themselves, leading coalition movements and engaging in grassroots organizing campaigns all across North America. Based out of Seattle, the Urban Indian Health Institute proudly proclaimed as being run by and for Native people, published a landmark report on the epidemic of murdered and missing Indigenous women in 2016. It outlined the outrageous levels of violence and sexual coercion experienced by Indigenous women, and the fact that most of the cases aren't even reported in the federal missing persons database. Mending the Sacred Hoop is a Duluth-based nonprofit run by Indigenous women that deals expressly with the threat of domestic violence in Indigenous communities. Their Sacred Hoop Tribal Coalition to Stop Violence Against Native Women serves all 11 federally recognized tribes in Minnesota with educational courses for men and women, and resources for survivors of domestic violence. The Coalition to Stop Violence Against Native Women was founded in New Mexico in 1996 to support Native advocates working to end domestic violence, sex trafficking, dating violence, and sexual assault in tribal communities. Their single goal? To eliminate violence against Native women and children. The Red Dress Project is an art installation created by Canadian Métis artist Jamie Black. It is an aesthetic response to the more than 1,000 missing and murdered Aboriginal women of Canada, and features empty red dresses blowing in the wind. It has been installed in public spaces across the United States and Canada, and is just one example of Native artists expressing their pain and demanding progress towards this devastating issue. What can we do to help? It's important to educate ourselves about Indigenous struggles and issues, and understand that they are deeply American issues related to the economy, race, class, gender, and sexuality. They are also international issues that have been tied to the history of settler colonialism since day one. In many ways, this can be considered one link in the ongoing U.S. tradition of robbing Native people of their autonomy. The 5-college Native American and Indigenous Studies program offers a myriad of classes and a certificate program addressed at cultural literacy and progressive research. It is also important to make our voices heard in support of ending the epidemic of missing and murdered Indigenous women. This means contacting your local officials and school administrators to let them know that this is a pressing issue that must be addressed. It means donating money to different Native organizations. Native communities in the U.S. have been greatly affected by the COVID-19 pandemic in addition to all of these long-standing systemic issues. This horrible problem has plagued entire communities of Native Americans for decades, but with newfound attention on the subject and legislative gains, there is hope for the future.